Hello and welcome back. In this video, we're going to continue with the next subtopic in Chapter 3. We'll be looking at speciation. So we'll be seeing more of Darwin's finches and also learn what makes a species. And of course, before we dive into the content, let's have a look at the learning outcomes. I hope that by the end of this lesson, you will be able to define the biological species concept, describe modes of speciation, state the processes that would lead to speciation, and last but not least, relate those processes to the 4 factors, which is reproductive isolation, genetic drift, hybridization, and adaptive radiation. If you're ready, let's get started. So, first things first, think, what is a species? I'm sure you have some idea of what a species is, especially after what we've gone through in Chapter 1 Biodiversity. And you also know that 2 organisms can be from the same genus and at the same time be of different species. There are many different ways to define species, but we usually use this one. Banyak definisi, kita suka yang ni. We usually use the biological species concept. And according to the biological species concept, a species is a group of populations whose members can interbreed under natural conditions to produce viable and fertile offspring and are reproductively isolated from other populations. So daripada banyak-banyak populasi ni, kalau mereka boleh saling membiak, under natural condition means naturally you leave it there, you don't need to take them into the lab, and then their offspring are viable and fertile, and they are reproductively isolated from other populations, then they are a species. Yang penting, dia boleh membiak sesama sendiri, anak dia sihat dan boleh membiak juga. Okay, so this is the biological species concept. Try to remember this if you can. And the speciation, the word speciation is meaning a process of forming new species through evolution. Apa tahu apa itu species? Speciation adalah proses menghasilkan species. Speciation can occur in kind of a few steps. Well, first things first, for you to create a new species, the population must become isolated from other populations. Means there's no gene flow between this population and other populations. And then, give it enough time. After some time, the evolutionary changes will accumulate and the populations will diverge in their characteristics. Give them enough time, they're going to have some genetic variability and become different from one another for whatever reason. When there is enough differences between parts of this population, enough differences accumulate so that the reproduction between the populations become impossible, then that is speciation. So asalkan dari satu populasi asal, for whatever reason, diorang menjadi berbeza sehingga pada tahap yang diorang tidak boleh saling membiak sudah. That means populasi asal ini sudah menjadi 2 populasi ataupun 2 spesies baru. Okay, so that is kind of like the basic idea of speciation. That was the basic idea. Now we'll talk about the modes of speciation. Cara atau macam kira cara mode speciation boleh berlaku. The first mode of speciation is allopatric speciation, and the second mode is sympatric speciation. Allopatric speciation is speciation that occurs when a physical or geographical barrier separates part of the population and preventing allele exchange and gene flow. Ada benda yang memisahkan sesuatu populasi sampailah belah kiri dan belah kanan itu terpisah. Diorang cukup berbeza, diorang tidak dapat membiak bila diorang jumpa balik. That is allopatric speciation. Sympatric speciation is speciation that does not involve geographical isolation. Tiada pemisahan yang physical. There is, however, a radical change in the genome of a subpopulation that will reproductively isolate it from the parent generation. So it's because of other factors, especially genetic factors, that make the population speciate. Okay, we're going to learn a bit more about them one by one. So once again, this is illustrations showing allopatric speciation over here. Yang kamu nampak ada sungai terbentuk, ini adalah allopatric speciation. Yang tiba-tiba pokok di tengah-tengah itu jadi warna yang berbeza, itu adalah sympatric speciation. In this picture over here with the fishes, the ones where the pond is separated by the soil, that one is allopatric speciation. The one where the pond is still connected but the fishes started becoming different color, that is sympatric speciation. Alright, so now I'm going to tell you more about allopatric speciation. Allos, or other, and patria, meaning native or homeland, makes up the words allopatric. So allopatric speciation or allopatric is also known as other country. Ini di-explain nama Greek itulah. So allopatric speciation is the formation of a new species that occurs within populations that are separated geographically. Geographical barriers may produce a barrier to gene flow because of spatial separation. Spatial separation could be because of formation of mountain ranges. It could be because they are separated by oceans or separated by rivers. So many types of geographical barriers. Yang penting dia adalah terpisah dan dia tidak dapat jumpa. In allopatric speciation, it goes to the inability of organisms or their gametes to meet, thus leading to reproductive isolation. Adaptation to the new conditions or random genetic drift in the small population can lead to changes in the allele and genotype frequency. Masa dia terpisah, dia tidak dapat reproduce, dia reproductive isolated. Masa dia reproductively isolated tu, mungkin dia ada mutation, mungkin ada genetic drift, dan menyebabkan allele dan genotype frequency dia berubah. So prolonged separation of populations may result in them becoming genetically isolated even if brought together. Kalau lama sudah kamu pisah, bertahun-tahun kamu kasih pisah diorang, lepas tu kamu kasih jumpa balik, ada kemungkinan diorang tidak dapat membiak sesama sendiri walaupun dia sudah jumpa balik. Sebab sudah cukup perbezaan dari segi genetik. So that means they will fail to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. In this way, allopatric speciation may lead new species to arise. So this is an example. First, you have an original beetle population. One day, a river forms and splits this population in two. One side of the river becomes this type of beetle. The other side of the river becomes this type of beetle. After many more years, the river dries up and the beetles can meet each other again. But because there is enough genetic differences between these two populations of beetles now, they have become two different species that cannot interbreed. We have a real-life example of this that we like to use. So these are two species of squirrels that you can find at the Grand Canyon. So the river used to be not this deep many millions years ago, if not thousands years ago. The animals from the left and the right side of the river could cross to each other. But this population of squirrels became separated, and over time the river causes erosion and it forms this huge canyon. So now on one side of the canyon, you would find the A. harrisii, which is on the south side of the canyon, the A. harrisii squirrels, and on the right side, you have the A. leucurus squirrels. So they used to be one same species, but over time, they have developed enough genetic differences that they are now two different species. Okay. If allopatric speciation is successful, you will have this graph or this diagram on the right. If allopatric speciation is not successful, you will have this diagram on the left, where after they meet again, they're going to be able to interbreed. Okay, so that is it for allopatric speciation. Now we're going to go into the second mode of speciation, which is sympatric speciation. Sym meaning together, patria meaning native or homeland, so sympatric is also known as same country speciation. Speciation in this mode will take place in geographically overlapping populations. Means, dua populasi ini adalah berada di kawasan yang sama. There is population of a new species without being geographically isolated. Sympatric speciation can occur because of polyploidy. Polyploidy yang tiba-tiba dia ada extra sets of chromosomes. So sympatric speciation can take place in some plant species by a mistake during cell division. So kalau tumbuhan tu tiba-tiba dia ada mutation, polyploidy, terlebih kromosom, then kemungkinan sympatric speciation boleh berlaku. Instead of separating the newly doubled chromosomes during the division stage, some cells in these plants will retain both sets of chromosomes, giving them 4 sets of homologous chromosomes instead of 2. Ini cuma explain apa itu polyploidy. And this is a diagram showing what I elaborated earlier. So in this diagram, we have an example of flowers in the same area. There are 2 species of flowers in the same area. In this one, the red and the yellow flowers will interbreed and produce an orange variety. This orange variety is sterile. So although it is sterile, it is a small population. It is maintained by sexual reproduction, asexual reproduction. But for random mutation, the chromosome doubling occurs and the sexual reproduction is now possible. The orange flowers will do sexual reproduction with each other. And eventually, the orange flowers will become a new species. In this area, there are now 3 species of flowers, which is the red, the yellow, and the new hybrid orange. The new hybrid orange is a result of allopolyploidy and hybridization. We also have another example here. This is more of an extra information. This is a real-life example of sympatric speciation. So 200 years ago, the ancestors of apple maggot flies laid their eggs only on hawthorn fruits. But today, these flies also lay egg on hawthorns, which are native to America, and on domestic apples, which were introduced to America by immigrants and bred in America. So there's 2 fruits that they can lay their eggs on. When it comes to mating and laying eggs, the females will generally choose to lay their eggs on the type of fruit they grew up in. And the males tend to look for mates on the type of fruit they grew up in. So, masing-masing macam balik kampung. Kalau dia asalnya daripada hawthorn fruit, dia akan cari pasangan dan lay eggs on the fruit that they grow up in. Kalau dia dari kecil dia dibesarkan atas apple, dia cari pasangan dan dia mau membiak pun dia buat di atas apple. So the hawthorn flies generally end up mating with other hawthorn flies, and the apple flies generally end up mating with other apple flies. So although they see each other, they don't choose each other. This means that the gene flow between parts of the population that mate on different types of fruits is reduced. So this whole shift from hawthorns to apples may be the first step towards sympatric speciation. In fewer than 200 years, some genetic differences between these 2 groups of flies have evolved. Meaning, in less than 200 years, because these flies prefer to choose their mates based on the type of fruits they grew up in, although they are living in the same area, they become reproductively isolated from each other. Okay, so this is example of sympatric speciation. Same area, but become 2 new species. We can, of course, compare between sympatric speciation and allopatric speciation. There is a similarity. A similarity is that sympatric and allopatric speciation will both lead to the formation of new species, but there are differences in that it could occur in the same or in different geographical areas. It could occur rarely or commonly. And does it usually involve animals or does it usually involve plants, etc., etc.? So a lot of the concept of sympatric and allopatric speciation, we are focusing on animals and plants. For microorganisms, it's harder to observe. So we're not focusing on them much for this chapter. Just a very short conclusion before we move on to the next part of 3.2 is that there are 2 general modes of speciation that are distinguished by mechanism in which gene flow among populations is initially interrupted. The first mode of speciation is allopatric speciation. The second mode of speciation is sympatric speciation. That's it for this segment. Now we're going to move on to the next part of speciation. We're going to think about what are the factors that lead to formation of a new species. There are 4 factors that you should know about, which is isolation, genetic drift, hybridization, and adaptive radiation. We're going to go into each of these factors in detail in a bit. And if you are revising this for your PSPM or for your UPS, this is one of the key points of chapter 3, which is to remember these factors involved in the formation of new species. Okay, if you're ready, let's continue. Just a very quick overview of each of these factors. We're going to have a look at their definitions before we have a look at each of them in more detail. So when it comes to isolation or reproductive isolation, we can define it as any physical or behavioral characteristic that prevents successful exchange of genes between members of different species or populations. Ini definisi dia. Genetic drift is when you have a random change in allele frequencies through the generations. Hybridization is a phenomenon that occurs when members of two different gene pools interbreed or sexually reproduce. And adaptive radiation is when there are bursts of divergences from a single lineage that gave rise to many new species, and each will be adapted to a vacant or new habitat or to using novel resources. So these are the definitions for each of them. And we're going to go into one of these factors in detail, one at a time. We're going to start with isolation. So when we talk about reproductive isolation, we are going to be talking about biological barriers that prevent two different species from interbreeding and produce viable fertile offspring. So ini kita boleh nampak dalam Allopatric dan Sympatric speciation juga. Apa yang menyebabkan dua populasi itu terpisah dan kemudian menjadi spesies? The speciation will only occur as a result of the formation of several barriers effectively isolating a species gene pool. It is a mechanism of action before or after fertilization. And therefore, there are two types of reproductive isolating mechanisms. There are prezygotic barriers, which are before fertilization, and postzygotic barriers, which is after fertilization. Secara ringkasnya, apa yang mau dikatakan di sini adalah reproductive isolation adalah bila dua populasi atau dua spesies itu tidak dapat membiak sama-sama, kan? Ada beberapa sebab kenapa diorang tidak dapat saling membiak ataupun membiak dengan efektif. Sebab-sebab itu boleh dipisahkan kepada dua kategori. Kategori pertama adalah prezygotic barrier, iaitu cabaran ataupun halangan sebelum pembentukan zygote. Dan kategori kedua adalah cabaran atau halangan kepada zygote yang sudah terbentuk itu. So, post-zygotic barrier and prezygotic barrier. And that can be very easily summarized in this form. So there are two types of reproductive isolation. Prezygotic barrier is the prevention of mating between individuals or prevention of fertilization of ovum. There are 5 types that we'll go into later. As for post-zygotic barrier, it is the prevention of the zygote from developing into a viable and fertile adult. And there are 3 types, which we will have a look later. Okay, let's start with the prezygotic barriers. The first prezygotic barrier is habitat isolation. This is when two species that occupy different habitats within the same area may encounter each other rarely. So we are going to use the example of the apple maggot flies or the hawthorn flies that we talked about in the Sympatric speciation earlier. So although they're in the same area, they're going to mate on different places. We're also going to compare it to its close relative, which lays eggs on blueberries. So even though they are not isolated by obvious physical barriers, because of their preferences, they do not meet and reproduce. Their preferences for where they live. The second type of prezygotic barrier is temporal isolation. Temporal isolation is when species that breed during different times of the day or different seasons or different years cannot mix their gametes because they do not meet each other. So, waktu untuk dia mengawan berbeza, jadi dia tidak terjumpa, jadi tiada sesi mengawan dan tiada persejawaan. That's it. The third is behavioral isolation. So, ini perbezaan dari segi perbuatan, sikap, tabiat sebelum mengawan dan sebagainya. In behavioral isolation, courtship behavior or rituals that attract mates and other behaviors unique to a species can be effective reproductive barriers even between closely related species. Such behavioral rituals enable mate recognition, which is a way to identify potential mates of the same species. Different species will have different courtship behavior with little or no attraction for mating to occur. So, dalam arti kata lain, lain-lain species dia ada perbuatan dia. Okay, they have different behaviors before they want to mate. So, if the male is showing the reproductive pattern for its species, but the female is from another species, it may not understand what the male is trying to say. The male is trying to say, I want to mate, but the female, because it's a different species, it has different reproductive ritual, it doesn't understand, and therefore, she will not allow him to mate with her. That is an example of behavioral isolation. So we have over here on the right side, behavioral isolation of blue-footed boobies. So boobies are birds that are inhabitants of the Galapagos Islands. They have a courtship ritual where they dance with their little blue feet. And it's quite an elaborate ritual. So part of the script will call for the male to do a high step, a behavior that calls the female attention to his bright blue feet. If the male is not able to do that, the female is not going to take notice of him. Or if a male does that to a different species, that different species of bird will not know what this blue-footed booby is actually doing. So that is an example of behavioral isolation. The fourth type of prezygotic barrier is mechanical isolation. In mechanical isolation, the mating is attempted, but because of morphological differences, it will prevent its successful completion. This could be due to incompatible genital structure or different reproductive organs. So the example we have in this slide is on floral anatomy. Because these flowers have different flower shapes, they have different pollinators. So this kind of flower shape will allow pollinators like bees to come and pollinate it with other flowers. Flowers with this shape will allow hummingbirds and moths to pollinate it, but not bees. So, dia tidak kongsi pollinator yang sama, dia tidak dapat reproduce dengan satu sama lain. Of course, you can also imagine mechanical isolation in animals as well. If the genital organs are not going to match each other, they're not going to be able to mate successfully. But if they're able to mate successfully, say for example, their reproductive organs are okay, or they just kind of do external fertilization, then they could have gametic isolation. Gametic isolation is a type of prezygotic barrier where the sperm of one species may not be able to fertilize the eggs of another species. So, dia punya sperm dengan ovum dia berjumpa, tapi dia tidak dapat fertilize sebab gamet dia berbeza. For instance, the sperm may not be able to survive in the reproductive tract of females of other species, or there are biochemical mechanisms that may prevent the sperm from penetrating the membrane surrounding the other species' eggs. Okay, so dalam ayat ni maksudnya, sperm bila dia masuk ke dalam rahim species lain, mungkin dia tidak dapat hidup dalam rahim tersebut. Dalam species dia sendiri, sejak dia dapat hidup. Ataupun sebab lain, mungkin sperm itu sudah jumpa dalam ovum tapi dia tidak dapat masuk ke dalam ovum tersebut. It cannot penetrate the ovum. So that's what this sentence means. The gametes of different species are incompatible or fail to fuse to form zygote. This is another reason for gametic isolation. Mungkin dia sudah berjumpa, sperm dengan ovum tu sudah berjumpa, tapi dia orang tidak dapat fuse. Dia punya nucleus tidak dapat fuse for whatever reason. So it's not going to produce a zygote. So we have this example in this slide over here, where we have the gametes of different species of sea urchins. Okay, so these are sea urchins. They are red and purple urchins, but they are unable to let their gametes fuse because the proteins on the surface of the eggs and the sperm of the urchins cannot bind to each other. So the red and the purple urchins are reproductively isolated from each other. So that is it on reproductive isolation for pre-zygotic barriers. Secara ringkasnya, untuk pre-zygotic barrier, nomor 1, tidak tinggal di kawasan sama. Nomor 2, tidak berjumpa pada masa yang sama. Nomor 3, tidak faham tabiat atau perbuatan dia. Nomor 4, tidak dapat mengawan sebab organ berbeza. Dan nomor 5, dapat mengawan tapi sperm dengan ovum tidak dapat fuse. Now we're going to go into the post-zygotic barrier. There are 3 types of post-zygotic barriers as well. Okay, in post-zygotic barrier, we're going into the first one, which is reduced hybrid viability or hybrid inviability. This is when the genes of different parent species may interact in ways that impair the hybrid's development or survival in its environment. The hybrid zygotes could fail to develop or fail to reach sexual maturity, which means they die at an early stage of embryonic development or developmental process is not completed, or they fail to become an adult. Ini sperm dengan ovum itu berjaya melakukan persenyawaan. They manage to do fertilization. So the zygote forms. The zygote becomes an embryo. But either the embryo dies in the womb or it hatches but never becomes an adult. And basically it fails to live to pass on its genes. Biasa kita cakap hybrid inviability. Dia mati. Hybrid niya senang mati. We have an example here with Rana pipiens and Rana sphenocephala. So these are 2 species of frogs. Their hybrid will be very they will have low fitness. They'll fail to mature before they become adults. They will die. And most of the hybrids do not complete their development and they become very frail and weak. So this is example of the first type of post-zygotic barrier, which is reduced hybrid viability. The second type of post-zygotic barrier is reduced hybrid fertility or hybrid sterility. So this is when the hybrid can live to be an adult, but it's not able to reproduce sexually. Even if the hybrids are vigorous means dia geragas, dia dapat hidup, okay? Dia tahan lasak. They may be sterile. If the chromosomes of the 2 parent species differ in number of structure, meiosis in the hybrids may fail to produce normal gametes. And since the infertile hybrids cannot produce offspring when they mate with either parent species, the genes cannot flow freely between the species. So we have this common example, which is the hybrid offspring of a male donkey and a female horse, which is a mule. It is robust, it can do a lot of work, but the mule is reproductively sterile. There is also a version called the hinny, which is the offspring of a female donkey and a male horse, which is also sterile. Okay, disebabkan perbezaan dari segi bilangan kromosom parents dia. Walaupun dia hidup, dia mandul. So, dia tidak dapat hasilkan baby dia sendiri. So, that's second type of post-zygotic barrier, hybrid sterility. The third type of post-zygotic barrier is hybrid breakdown. This is when some first-generation hybrids, which is F1, they will be viable and fertile so they can produce their own offspring. But when they mate with another or with their parent species, the offspring of the next generation are feeble or sterile. So generasi pertama saja yang macam okay, second generation dia macam kurang sesuai untuk survive. So we have an example here is hybrids between 2 strains of cultivated rice, which are vigorous and fertile. However, the plants in the next generation carry too many of the recessive alleles and they become small and sterile as are in the center. Okay, so itu sahaja untuk pre-zygotic dengan post-zygotic barrier, and therefore that is all of it for reproductive isolation. Now we're moving on to the second factor involved in formation of a new species. We're going to talk about genetic drift. All right. So for genetic drift, this is relating a bit to what we learned in Chapter 5 in the previous semester. Genetic drift is a process in which chance events cause unpredictable fluctuations in allele frequencies from one generation to the next. Effects of genetic drift are most pronounced in small populations. So these are random events, okay? Bila-bila masa boleh berlaku. Dan dia akan menyebabkan fluctuation in allele frequency. If you remember allele frequency, the P and the Q from the Hardy-Weinberg equation, yeah? So it's going to cause those numbers to go up and down and up and down. And this is going to have a bigger effect in smaller populations. A random or unpredictable change in allele frequency within a population due to chance rather than natural selection. Effects of genetic drift is it will reduce the overall genetic variability and shift the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium of the population. Genetic drift is significant in small populations. These chance events can cause an allele to be disproportionately overrepresented or underrepresented in the next generation. So, dominant allele itu mungkin terlebih banyak ataupun terlebih sedikit pada generasi seterusnya akibat genetic drift. And genetic drift tends to alter allele frequency substantially only in small populations. Maksud ayat kedua ni, biasanya dia akan ubah genetic frequency, allele frequency, dalam populasi yang kecil saja. Kalau populasi yang besar, dia tidak akan rasa genetic drift. Genetic drift can cause allele frequencies to change at random over time. And they can lead to a loss of genetic variation within populations. And they can eliminate alleles from a population. Genetic drift can cause harmful alleles to become fixed. Alleles that are neither harmful nor beneficial can be lost or become fixed, which means they reach a frequency of 100% by chance through genetic drift. Maksud ayat di sini adalah, disebabkan genetic drift, gene yang memudarat kita pun boleh kekal dalam populasi kita. Become fixed means it remains in our population even though it doesn't bring us any good. So, walaupun allele itu memudaratkan kita, kalau itu saja allele yang tinggal dalam populasi kita, semakin kita membiak, semakin kita akan paskan allele tersebut. Walaupun dia tidak membawa kebaikan, dia cuma memudaratkan. Fixed, maksudnya dia stay dalam populasi. The survival and the reproductive success of species is not related to the genotype or phenotype as in natural selection. So, genetic drift ini berbeza sikit dengan natural selection. Sama ada individu itu survive ataupun tidak, sama ada dia dapat membiak ataupun tidak, dia kurang berkait dengan dia punya genotype ataupun phenotype. Genetic drift will play an important role in speciation and evolution, and the factors involved in genetic drift are geographical barrier, environmental factors, non-random mating, mutation, and migration. And there are two types of genetic drift that we'll learn about, which is the founder effect and the bottleneck effect. Mungkin genetic drift ini lebih make sense bila kita tengok dua jenis genetic drift tersebut. Okay, so genetic drift, especially for the founder effect, is more or less like this. We started out with a population with a lot of genetic variety, but for some reason, something happened, and only some of the plants will leave offsprings. And eventually, the newer generations will only follow the allele frequency of some. Dia punya allele frequency semakin berubah mengikut generasi, sampailah itu saja allele yang tinggal dalam generasi tersebut, dalam population tersebut. So we'll talk about the founder effect. So we start with a genetically diverse population, but then some of those individuals get isolated. And due to selective pressure, this is the new allele frequency of the population. Occurs when small population is isolated or they migrate from a larger population. The new and smaller population become pioneer individuals which may have a different gene pool. So, biasanya ini adalah daripada populasi yang besar, sekumpulan kecil daripada mereka akan berpindah kepada tempat baru. So, bila dia sampai di tempat baru, dia menjadi pioneer, pengasas untuk kawasan tersebut. And they will have a different gene pool compared to the original population. After a few generations, the gene pool or the allele frequencies of the new population will differ from the original population. So, populasi baru di kawasan baru ini berbeza dengan populasi asal di kawasan asal. So, just to elaborate more, founder effect is when a few individuals become isolated from a larger population. This smaller population may establish a new population whose gene pool differs from the source population. This is called the founder effect because they found the new place. The founder effect probably accounts for the relatively high frequency of certain inherited disorders among isolated human populations. Maksud ayat ketiga ni, founder effect mungkin menjadi sebab kenapa dalam certain population, especially kalau population itu baru berpindah daripada tempat ataupun kawasan lain, dan populasi yang berpindah itu dia ada frekuensi yang lebih tinggi untuk sesetengah penyakit yang keturunan. So we have a few examples here. We have the example of Amish populations, which are German-speaking immigrants in the US and Canada. And we have the British colonists that founded a settlement on Tristan da Cunha, which is on the island Atlantic Ocean, which have this common occurrence of retinitis pigmentosa. So we'll have a look here. In the Tristan da Cunha colonization, so cerita dia, untuk yang warna hijau gelap ni, cerita dia, orang-orang Britain ni, masa dia orang tahu ada pulau di Southern Atlantic Ocean, naik kapal, pindah pergi sana, entah apa sebab dia orang, but they moved there. So when they moved there, they created a new colony, new population. When they reach there, they are going to breed with each other. One of the people who arrive on the island, one of the colonists, carries a recessive allele for retinitis pigmentosa, which is this condition down here. In the retina, he starts developing clumps, pigment clumps. Of course, after many generations, he's going to have children. His children will have children. Eventually, when you look at the population on that island, more than one person, if not a majority of them, will have retinitis pigmentosa. So in this example, the British colonists are the founders for this population on the island, and they are the ones bringing this recessive allele to the island. The one about the Amish population I'm speaking here, this is when we have a German population moving from Germany into the US, and they tend to stay in their own groups among their own people, so they become the founders of German-speaking immigrants in the US and Canada. We also have this other effect that uses the founder effect, which is the Ellis Van Creveld syndrome. This is a syndrome that causes short stature, polydactyly, and several other abnormalities. Since the members of this population only have children with other members of the Amish population, no genetic variation is being introduced. Now, the percentage of people in this Amish community with Ellis Van Creveld syndrome is much higher than the percentage of people with the disease in the rest of the United States. So this Ellis Van Creveld syndrome is an example how, because the population of Amish people in the US only breed with each other, this recessive allele becomes spread among the Amish people, and it becomes more common in their populations than in the rest of the country. So macam dia bawa, dan allele itu semakin banyak di populasi mereka. So that is it for founder effect. Now we're going to be talking about the bottleneck effect. Bottleneck effect occurs when there is a sudden decrease in the original population size due to sudden change in the environment, such as a natural disaster. So for whatever reason, mula-mula populasi asal dia ramai orang, tapi berlaku bencana, yang survive, yang masih tinggal sedikit sahaja, dan sedikit sahaja orang ini akan membiak dan hasilkan next generation. So kamu boleh tengok daripada parent ataupun original population dengan next generation ada perbezaan dari segi dia punya allele frequency. Ini banyak kuning, ini banyak biru. So this is called a bottlenecking event, and they are usually natural disasters. Dia dipanggil bottleneck sebab dia ibarat macam kalau kita tuang benda keluar daripada leher botol ni, sedikit saja yang dapat keluar. Okay, so bottleneck effects, these usually include things like earthquakes, floods, droughts, and fire, and the small surviving population will have a different gene pool or allele frequency from the original population. Certain alleles may be overrepresented, other alleles may be underrepresented, and some alleles may be eliminated. So macam yang kuning dengan biru tadi, original population dia kuning banyak, new population, new generation, kuning dia sedikit, biru dia banyak. So dalam ini biru overrepresented, yellow underrepresented. Bottleneck effects will reduce genetic variability because some alleles will be eliminated. And we have this common example. We usually use the example of cheetahs to show bottleneck effect. Cheetahs nearly became extinct years ago, probably because of overhunting by humans. And the few surviving cheetah capable of mating, they were capable to mate, but they were greatly reduced in their genetic variations. Sebab sedikit saja cheetah yang tinggal, jadi genes yang tertinggal pun sedikit. And of course they try to mate with each other, but because there is so little individuals left, the cheetah population today is almost genetically uniform. All the alleles become underrepresented. So as we see here, a bottleneck effect occurs when the population is suddenly reduced in size due to drastic reduction in the population size. Could be because there is depletion in food supply, tidak cukup makanan. There could be because of flooding, banjir, diseases, penyakit, natural disasters, or because of overhunting. In the case of cheetahs, it's because of overhunting. It could cause a genetic drift in small population of survivors. There's a change in allele frequencies or a shift from the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. There is a change in the gene pool because only a few individuals would contribute genes to the entire future population. And the surviving alleles may be overrepresented or underrepresented, or they may be absent, or one allele may be eliminated by chance. And regardless of whether that allele is beneficial, harmful, or of no particular advantage or disadvantage, they could get passed on. And thus, genetic drift will decrease genetic variation within the population. They might increase genetic differences among different populations. So kalau sini satu population cheetah yang survive, sana satu population cheetah yang survive, population A dengan population B akan ada genetic difference. That's what this sentence means. And they could carry this allele to the next generation and lead to formation of new species. Apa yang dicakapkan di sini, this very long text is explanation of bottleneck effect. So kalau kamu diminta untuk explain or elaborate on bottleneck effects, you can go back to these two slides for the points. Okay, but basically remember the diagram pun cukup sudahlah untuk pahami konsepnya. And then we're moving on to the third factor involved in the formation of the new species, which is hybridization. Hybridization, it is production of new hybrid or new species through interbreeding between two subspecies or closely related species. Example of hybridization we usually see in plants, in allopolyploidy in plants. F1 or first generation hybrid is usually sterile because there is no homologous chromosome for meiosis, so no gamete is produced. But allopolyploidy, especially in plants, can overcome this sterility by doubling the number of chromosomes, producing a fertile organism. And the fertile polyploidy may then form a new subspecies or species. So ini yang macam gambar red, yellow, and orange flower that I showed earlier. But we could also use this example of wheat. So untuk gandum, 8,000 years ago, there was spontaneous hybridization between emmer wheat and goat grass, and when the two of them bred, it becomes the wheat that we use to make bread. So the scientific names for them is Triticum turgidum, and the scientific name for goat grass is Aegilops tauskii, and the bread wheat's scientific name is Triticum aestivum. So this is kind of a representation of what the alleles look like. The whole genome is then becoming assisted breeding and causes improved yield. So beginilah dia punya diagram untuk tunjukkan hybridization antara gandum asal dengan this wild thing, and it becomes gandum yang kita gunakan untuk buat roti sekarang. Okay. So yeah, this is wheat. That's it. That is the most common example that we will use. We don't usually use the animal ones because the animal ones don't usually do successful allopolyploidy. Usually plants would be the one doing the successful hybridization through allopolyploidy. All right, we're going into the final factor involved in the formation of a new species, which is adaptive radiation. So in adaptive radiation, it is when you have the evolution from one species of animals or plants to a number of different forms, which are then adapted to different ecological habitat and niche. You start with one species. And then from that one species, it becomes many different species with many different shapes. And those many different shapes will go to different places or eat different foods or do different things. Adaptive radiation are bursts of divergences from a single lineage that gave rise to many new species, each adapted to a vacant or new habitat or to using a novel recourse. They share homologous structure, which is modified to perform a variety of function or adaptation to different habitat and modes of life. Homologous structure yang dimaksudkan ini, bila spesies-spesies baru itu terbentuk, mereka akan ada satu organ, satu structure yang homologous dengan satu sama lain. Meaning from the original species, it was maybe one shape of beak. In the 5 new species, it will be beak, but different shapes of beak. Dia berasal daripada structure yang sama, tapi sekarang mereka sudah evolusi dan beradaptasi mendapat bentuk yang berbeza, ciri-ciri yang berbeza, tapi dia masih berasal daripada structure yang sama. That is what is meant by homologous. So we can see here in this example, we're once again going back to the finches on the Galapagos Islands. So when the first finches arrived in the Galapagos, they were all seed-eating ground finches. But in the different islands, in different areas of the islands, there were different types of food available. And so there was disruptive selection happening over many thousands, if not millions of years. All the finches on the Galapagos Islands become diversified into many different species. So daripada satu species yang asal, dia menjadi 3 species. Setiap species tu mungkin berpisah lagi menjadi 4, berpisah lagi menjadi 3. Sehingga kita ada berapa species di sini? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 4, 13 species yang berbeza. Okay, so all these different species, the homologous structure is the beak. But as you can see, although their beaks are different shapes and adapted to different environments, they all come from the same ancestor bird. Dia ada moyang ataupun asal-usul yang sama. Why is adaptive radiation important? It's important so that organisms can adapt to various new habitats or niche, and they can adapt to different food source. Okay, so adaptive radiation ni penting supaya mereka dapat adapt. They can make themselves more suitable to their environment. When they are adapting to their environment and they are using different resources going to different areas, they are reducing competition for each other. While they are in the same habitat, they won't be competing for the same food or for the same resources, sometimes not even the same places. Okay, so that is the importance of adaptive radiation. Okay, common example is the beak size and shape of Galapagos finches. So adaptive radiation, okay, this is explanation from what I said earlier. The ancestors for the finches on the Galapagos Islands originated from the mainland, and they were seed eaters. They had a short and straight beak. The finches in the Galapagos, they show different adaptive features for different types of food. There are cactus finches, plant-eating finches, insect-eating finches, etc. And they all have different varieties of beaks and different food source. They reduce competition with each other for food, resources, and habitats. Okay, so those are the 4 factors that are involved in the formation of a new species, and also all their elaborations and explanations. Thank you for sticking with me through it all, and just a very quick summary of what we did. In this 3.2 video, we looked at modes of speciation, Sympatric and Allopatric, and then we talk about the factors that are involved in the formation of a new species. So with that very long lesson, thank you. What should you do now? Go ahead and come up with your own notes for 3.2 and then complete the tutorial questions for chapter 3, parts A and B. Try part C if you feel like it, but it's not really compulsory. So thank you very much for your time and your attention, and I will see you again soon. Thank you and bye.